Hi, in this video I'm going to go over how to put in your shoulder pads and sleeve head. As your whole jacket hangs off of your shoulders, it's important to have good support, and that's what the shoulder pads provide. So in my example, I did a shoulder pad out of hair canvas, covered in hair canvas, and a shoulder pad covered with my muslin. I also sewed this in with a cross stitch to the canvas on the front of my jacket, and then a running stitch into the seam allowance of my sleeve. On this side, I just tacked it to the seam allowance in 3 different spots of the sleeve and to the shoulder seam allowance. Other than that, they both have batting in them, multiple layers of batting in them. And then the sleeve head is the part of the jacket that just fills in the extra ease of the sleeve cap. So without it, this could be wrinkly or hang softly. With it, it just provides a little bit more stability and brings it out just a tiny bit. On one side, I did a double fold with hair canvas. On the other side, I did a single fold with muslin. And it is very obvious on both sides when you look at the two sides that this one fills in that extra ease very well all the way around, while this one is not quite filling it in completely. So you want to make sure that you are putting in the right type for the type of fabric you're using as well. So I'm using a very thin cotton. So I may not want to have a stiff sleeve head, but I don't really want to see these wrinkles either. You don't need to worry about the sleeve heads or the shoulder pads being unsightly, because this will all be covered up with lining afterwards. So they don't have to be too tidy, they just have to be sewn in well. Okay, the supplies you are going to need is your shoulder pad pattern, a marker or a pen, and a ruler. You will also need some muslin, some hair canvas, some batting, and I have a few thicknesses here. So I have a very thin one, a thicker, like a very thick one, and in between. This has multiple layers that you can pull off and feather out if you need to have that on your shoulder pad. And so let's get started. So the first thing you're going to do is mark on your pattern that you need to cut this on the bias. So I basically took my mat here that I have my bias grain line marked here, and I know that my shoulder is going to go straight across here from my little mark that was on the pattern. So if I place this on my mark and then kind of straighten it out so that it's more or less vertical and horizontal on my grid here, then I can line up my shoulder with one of these bias marks and mark my grain line there. So that's all I simply did in order to get my bias on my shoulder pad pattern. You need this for cutting out your muslin or cutting out your hair canvas. So when you cut these out, they should be on the bias so that they have a little bit of stretch, right, going this way and this way rather than this way and this way. So that way when you're sewing this, it helps it conform to the shoulder. Okay, so I did that. The other thing I did was I marked my pattern piece, because when you cut out your padding, you're going to cut out 3 different sizes. So I cut out 1 piece or 2 pieces that were my full size, and then about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch in, I marked it, because this is a half size pattern, so it would normally be a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch in, depending on your amount that you needed to stagger it in, and then again 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch in, creating 3 different size pattern pieces for my shoulder pad, and then that all gets sandwiched in with a 4th piece and then covered with either muslin, or I'm going to demonstrate cutting out with my hair canvas, because I'm going to do 2 different types of shoulder pad here. I'm going to line up my grain line with those grain lines on my hair canvas, so I want to make sure that they are just going in the same direction, and then I'm going to put a couple pins in there. If you have your selvage intact, you can make sure that this arrow is parallel to your selvages. I'm just eyeballing it and making sure that it's parallel to my grain line on my canvas. So you can do this 2 ways. You can just put your pattern piece on and mark it out, or you can trace around it like so and then cut it out. Whichever you prefer is fine. Just make sure that you're consistent, because if you cut with scissors on one and then trace with the other, and if you cut outside your trace marked lines, your pattern piece is going to end up larger than if you just cut next to the pattern. And if you want, you can double up your pieces so that you can get 2 pieces cut at the same time, which is what I'm going to do, because I do want to have 2 of these. So just make sure your grain lines are lined up if you're going to do this. So like that. Okay, so I'm then going to take my scissors and I'm just going to cut around my pattern, making sure, so this is my outer part of my shoulder pad, so it is going to end up with being the same size as the top layer of my batting. All right, so just cutting around there. So you can see that I'm cutting off my blue line, whereas if I remove this, chances are I'd be tempted to cut outside my blue line. That way I'm certain that I haven't cut too much of my pattern off, which would make it ever so slightly bigger all the way around. Okay, so I have my pieces, and then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to make that sandwich layer. So now my shoulder pad is marked front and back, and the way that I mark that is from the center mark, I moved my notch towards the front 1 inch, so that's 1/2 scale inch. So in this pattern it's a 1/2 inch. On a full-size shoulder pad it would be 1 inch towards the front, so from the halfway point towards the front, because your shoulder pad curls around into your jacket and you have a little bit longer piece that goes into the back than into the front. So this shoulder pad, if I curled it this way, would actually be for my left sleeve, because this is the edge. It's going to go like this in there, and this mark, this notch mark, would line up with my shoulder and into the seam there, just like so. Okay, so a little bit less in the front and a little bit longer in the back. I'm going to cut 4 of these, so I'm going to lay my piece on here. Now batting doesn't have a bias, so I don't have to worry about it on this one, but I'm just going to take my marker and zoom in a little bit. So I'm just going to take my marker and I'm just going to trace around my batting here. And then I will cut that out. Right on my mark, just like so. Okay. And then I'm going to do that again for the other one. So I'm going to take my pattern piece. Now I could cut this pattern down after I've used it the first 2 times, or I can trace it and then measure in that 3/8 of an inch around, so that I end up getting it a little bit smaller. So just mark it in, and then just, you can eyeball it like a little bit less on the sides here, and then 3/8 again on this side. So when I go to cut this out, I'll cut it on the inner line instead of the outer line, and then on the other one, or you can even trace the pattern and make your own little duplicate, smaller patterns, whichever works for you. And then just as long as the two pieces that go on the inside are 3/8 smaller, and then again 3/8 smaller from that. So if I take this and trace it and then measure again 3/8 smaller, I will get what I need. So it doesn't have to be perfect, just you want to grade it down so that you end up with 2 smaller pieces on the inside. So shoulder pads can be more than 4 layers thick, but it just depends on, it can be up to 3/4 of an inch thick, even 1 inch thick back in the 90s. Or you could end up, and you can have a difference from the left and right shoulder of 1/2 inch as well. So I just have my little sandwich here where everyone's just a little bit shorter than the other, and then this one would go on top, and then our 2 muslin pieces on top of that. So this is quite a thick shoulder pad for such a small little shoulder. So I'm probably actually going to take out one of these layers for this half scale sample and only do it like this because it's so thick. As this is a pretty thick batting, I'm going to feather my edges. So this means that you're going to pull some of the batting away from the edges in order to get it to be a little bit lighter and thinner at the edges. And you can do this in all of the layers that you're doing in order to make it a little bit softer and thinner and less of a big contrast where all of the edges stop. And you don't do this on this edge though. This is going to be go into your arm's eye on the sleeve and the shoulder seam, so it's going to be very crisp and clean there, but this one can be feathered out. Okay, and then you would do that as well on your other ones. Okay, so once you get your edges feathered, go ahead and, if you can, like roll this on a towel or something and steam it just a little bit to help encourage those kind of to meld together. And then you can also steam it just a little on the edges, just to get those to kind of go together. And then place my last bit of canvas. Now right away you want to start manipulating and curling your shoulder pads so that it starts to take shape. So as you hand sew your pad stitching, forming your pieces, that it's already wants to take the shape of a shoulder and be curved. So after I finish pad stitching this will stay curved and it will no longer be flat like it is. So so I'm just going to take my pins to help me keep that in place as I pad stitch, and what you're going to see is that the top layer will end up curling and be shortened compared to the bottom layer, and that is fine. You can trim down the bottom layer, but that also means that you don't want to pad stitch to the very edges because you'll be trimming. Okay, so you can see that my layers have all shifted here and a little bit over here, and that's fine. I just want to make sure that that it's curling, and so then I'll end up having this nice curled shoulder pad, which will end up working well on an actual real shoulder. Okay, so I want to mark which way is my front and which way is my back. So with that notch mark that is offset, so then that becomes the center of my shoulder pad right there across. So that will be the shoulder seam would go across here, and then the front is a little shorter and the back is a little longer. So approximately 1 inch shorter in the front than the back. And so let's get to pad stitching. So I have pre-waxed and measured my threads. Shoulder pad takes shape because the stitches hold it that way. Okay, so here is my finished shoulder pad for the, what did I say? This is going to be for the left side of my jacket, so it'll fit in there just like so. So it'll be just like this inside the jacket. And so when you're going to put this in, because you're putting it in and the shoulder is going the opposite direction, so the curvature is opposite. If you anchor it at the centers first and then bring your fabric up and sew it on, it works a little better. Since this is my hair canvas side and this is the hair canvas side of my jacket, I am going to actually do this the tailored, more couture method, which is I would hand sew this with a cross stitch or a herringbone stitch around directly onto the canvas itself, and then sew it by hand to the seam allowance here. Okay, so that is how I'm going to do this. I'm happy with this, and then here, this little edge that's sticking out a little bit, I am going to trim that down so that it's all covered in the canvas. Now this is all going to be hidden away inside of your lining, so it doesn't really matter that that's sticking out, but you can definitely have it there if or leave it there if you want, but I'm cutting it off just so it looks uniform and nice all the way around. But you can see that it has a nice little taper all the way around, and again you can press that to compress it a little bit more. And so then I'm going to take my jacket, I'm going to just fold back my facing, I'm going to find that shoulder seam, and I'm going to line it up so that the cut edges of the arm's eye and the shoulder pad are together, and that mark is on top of my shoulder seam. I'm just going to put a pin in it, and then I'm going to flip it over to the right side, and I want to pin and baste this down so that it has the cut edges of the shoulder pad are even with the seam allowance of the arm's eye. And so I'm just going to put a pin in it to hold it in place there, and I'm going to feel around to the other side. So what I did is I just made sure that these two edges were even, but that it was curving the proper way on my shoulder. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here. So just make sure your seam allowance of your sleeve is going towards the sleeve, and then that you're trying to get these two to be even, but with the right curvature. So you're going to just fold that around and hold it in place and smooth it out, and then just put a pin in it right at the end there. Baste it in place temporarily so that you know that it's where it's supposed to be. So I'm just basting this down with just really long stitches, and that way I know it's going to stay in place where I want it to be. Okay, then I can take that pin out, and I'm just going to put in a tack right through here. So I'm just going to go all the way through and then down again, and I'm going to keep this loose. I don't want it to be so tight. I don't want it pulling on my shoulder pad and the fabric. I don't want to like see that oh, that's where the shoulder pad was sewn. And so I'm just going right through to the just through the seam allowance and the edge of the shoulder pad, and then these two edges are even. Okay, I'm just gonna do a running stitch across here to the other side, and then I'll do the same. I'll tack it at the shoulder seam on the far side, just right here. So I'm just gonna, I have it lined up with the stitching line, and then I'm just gonna go through this into the seam allowance only of my shoulder seam allowance and the shoulder pad, anchoring that in place right here. And then that gives me a good starting position to hand stitch this across the canvas of my jacket. So I'm going to gently fold back my facing there, and then I want to make sure that this comes up to meet my arm's eye seam allowance, comes up to meet my shoulder, so that it's going to be like this when it's done. Sometimes when you line up this doesn't exactly line up, and that is exactly the other reason why you don't sew right to the edge. You might have to trim some of that off in order for them to all be lined up. Okay, so now I'm going to do my herringbone stitch. So that's the cross stitch where I go from my shoulder pad across to my jacket seam allowance. So I'm not sewing through the jacket. I don't want this to show on the wrong side or on the right side. And then back into my shoulder pad, and then back into my canvas of my jacket, canvas only, then back into my shoulder pad. And I'm just doing very large X's. So this is the one where the needle is always pointing. If you're right-handed, it's always pointing to the left. And then with every stitch, so I go in, it's pointing to the left. I'm just catching the canvas of the jacket. Then I'm going into the shoulder pad, and I can catch as many layers as I want, but you want to keep these stitches loose. You don't want this to be obvious that, oh, yep, there's the shoulder pad, that's where it was sewn on. So again, these stitches, again, they're a little hard to see, but I just went like across here, and then across here, and then across here. So they ended up being like a cross stitch all the way across the edge, just past the edge of my shoulder pad into the canvas. Okay, so, and then I'm going to go right into like all the way to the sleeve seam allowance. And then when I get to this corner, again, I'm just going to loosely go in and out of this corner, a few stitches straight up and down, just tacking it in place. And again, these are very loose tacks. And again, pre-waxing and ironing your thread and making sure that they're not too long is important. And then now I'm going to go to the other corner of my shoulder pad and anchor it to this side. So again, I'm just going to go through the layers multiple times, and then taking a few small stitches to secure it. But again, don't pull too tight. You want it loose enough that it can have a little bit of movement in order to not show that that's where it was sewn down. So this very last one, I'll do a little loop. Okay, so that shoulder pad is more or less in place. So so it's attached fully on the front canvas area, here, 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 and back here. And then all of that will be covered with my lining when I go to sew this in. So this shoulder pad, I'm going to put in the speed tailoring method, where we just tack it to the shoulder seam allowance at the edge of the pad here, at the edge of the pad here, and at the edge of the pads down here. So I'm not going to do it the way that I did it on the other side. So there will be, because I don't have that canvas to stitch to. So I've just pinned it in a few different places. You can also baste it in place so that it stays until the jacket is complete. And then you can also take your pins out. So I don't have to go all the way through the shoulder pad. I just need to get it attached to the jacket long enough so I can sew it in place. All right, that should be good. And then I can take my pins out and flip it over and tack it. So these are very loose tacks. You don't want them to be super tight, and you do want to knot your thread for this one. Okay, so I'm coming through the seam allowance and through the shoulder pad, and I'm going to do this multiple times, like 4 or 5 times, just tacking this right only to the seam allowance through all the layers, but leaving it loose like the shank of a button. So you want to have a bit of flexibility there so the shoulder pad doesn't pull and look awkward. So I've gone through there about 6 times, and then I'm just going to check to make sure that I have a little bit of a shank there, and I do. So I'm going to tie that off and then move on to my next point that I'm trying to secure. Okay, so the next point I am going to secure is just here at the center of the shoulder pad, and I'm going to go in and out about 6 times, but keeping it loose so that I don't have a pucker in my shoulder pad or a visible stitching on the outside of the garment. Okay. And I'm just going through the seam allowance, so you want to make sure you do not go through this jacket fabric or the sleeve fabric. So, and then make sure you knot that well. And then it's not so tight that I'm squishing it. I'm keeping it kind of loose. Okay, so I'm going to do this 2 more spots at the other point of the shoulder pad and at the seam allowance here. So just be careful when you're going up and through that you're just going through the seam allowance and not the jacket. And again, leave it loose. If you've pulled it too tight, just gently, before you put your knot in, just gently pull them apart to give some ease into those stitches. And then your last one on the other part of the shoulder pad. Okay. And this is a lot easier if you've basted it. If you still have pins in it, you're just going to be stabbing yourself and fighting with that shoulder pad in order to keep it where it's supposed to be. Okay, so this is our finished speed tailored shoulder pad. So it should fill in that shoulder nicely. You can see that it just is tacked to the inside here, 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 and here. So that is the speed tailoring method for when you've done an iron-on or no interfacing at all on the inside. And then my edges of my shoulder pad are even with the seam allowance edges of my sleeve and jacket. And then it's looks like this on the outside. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to do a sleeve head. So this one already has its sleeve head in, and it's just a narrow strip of fabric, canvas and batting. It could also be muslin, put into the shoulder area. It could be folded double and then folded again, or it could just be a single layer. It could be so long that it goes all the way from the front notch to the back notch, or it could just be in the top half of the sleeve cap itself and not that long. So it could be wide, it could be narrow. There's so many ways to do it. Here is a couple of samples of your sleeve head. The sleeve head is cut with either hair canvas or muslin, cut on the bias that allows it to stretch and mold around the shoulder. It could be rounded off and then pressed into an arc, which is what I'm going to do today. And I'm going to do a single layer, but I'm going to do it with my muslin. So first I'm going to take this and I'm just going to curve my ends here so that they aren't quite so sharp when I have them in the shoulder, and then they might show through the fabric. So, and I've made mine 7 inches long, but it could be 5 inches long because we're doing half scale. You would double that for a full size. Okay, so I'm at the iron and I'm cut my muslin on the bias, so it allows me to shape and fold this as I just pull and stretch. And I want the ends that are curled to be going towards the sleeve, so I'm going to shape and stretch this on into an arc like this on my curled side. So I'm stretching the non-cut side to just slowly curve this little by little. And get that into the shape I'm looking for. Okay. And then that will allow me to insert that into the sleeve cap, so that this is going to be sewn with a single layer right in there. Now, this doesn't get centered. It actually gets shifted about 1 inch to the back, but on our half scale, that would be half an inch. So I just put a crease in there, and then I'm going to mark this so that it's a ½ inch. So my crease is here, and I'm just going to mark it ½ inch to the front so that I can then find my shoulder seam, which is a little hard because it's covered by the shoulder pad, but just straight down this line. And then I have a little mark here on my shoulder pad where I did have it, or if I could peel back the sleeve seam allowance, I could just see it there. Now I don't want this abutted to the edge of my sleeve. I'm actually going to push this even further into the sleeve than that, so it's not exactly, so you're going to basically grade it, so you're going to step it down so it's not quite so much fabric there. And then I'll pin this in place, making sure I match the curvature of my arm side. And this is a bit on the long side, I feel, because it goes a little bit past my notch point, so I'll probably cut off about 1 inch on that side. And then on this side I could leave it longer, but again, I feel that it's a bit too long, so I'll cut 1 inch off of that. Okay, so I've pinned this in so that it's just a little bit in from my edge of my seam, but because I only have a ½ inch seam allowance, I don't have a lot to work with, so I'm only putting it in about a 1/4 inch because it gives me a 1/4 inch to sew this in, and I'm just going to sew it in with a long running stitch. And I'm doing this as a single layer. Sometimes you would take these two and stack them on top of each other and then just fold them in half, and I'm not going to fold them exactly in half. I'm going to stagger them just a little bit, and then I'm going to put a pin in it because I'm going to be trimming off the ends a little bit, and I'm going to be basting these together just like this. So again, I just have them staggered just a little bit here. That just grades it a little bit without actually having to cut it. And then you would sew it with the fold towards the sleeve and stagger that. So I'm going to baste this in place. So I'm going to go ahead and notch this side. And then I'm just basting this into the seam allowance only. Just make sure that you don't get it through to the jacket's right side. And not too tight, because you want to be able to keep the curvature of the arm's eye. And if you do it too tight, you could actually end up forcing it to try to go the other way. So the point of this is, again, just to fill in the sleeve cap so that it doesn't hang and is floppy. So, and again, it gets covered by the lining. All right, and then just knot it at the other end. Okay, so that's basted in, and then we'll just check to make sure it doesn't show on the right side. And then you'll give everything a little bit of a steam. Let's put a pin in there. Right here. So you shouldn't be able to see it at all on this side. And it just nicely fills in that shoulder. And so if you had any wrinkles in there, it just fills it out. And then I'll take this to the iron and give it a little bit of a pressing. So if you have something, because this is such a small jacket, if you have something that you can get in there to help you press it, it is helpful. Even a rolled up washcloth or a towel can help out. Remember to use your steam to soften the fabric, and then use the heat to set it. And if you have delicate fabric, make sure you use a pressed cloth in order to protect it. If you have a sleeve board, it also is helpful for pressing, on a full-size garment especially. So since this is so small, I'm not pressing a crease into my sleeve, and I'm hanging the other side off the edge so I don't accidentally put a crease on the other side. And just keep rolling and rotating so you can get everything. Once you have finished sewing in your shoulder pad and sleeve head, you can take a look at it from the outside. You can see how nicely the sleeve head fills in the extra ease from the sleeve cap area of the sleeve, and then the shoulder pad provides stability and structure so that your jacket will hang nicely on the body. And so then the next step after this will be to sew on your bound buttonhole and then assemble your lining.